Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place, and they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Guilty. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Guilty. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty. Not guilty. Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar.
Guilty.
Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan.
Guilty.
Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis.
Not guilty.
Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey.
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall.
Not guilty.
Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez.
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley.
Guilty.
Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski.
Guilty.
Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy.
Guilty.
Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch.
Not
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen.
Guilty.
Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds.
Not guilty.
Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio.
Not guilty.
Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders.
Guilty.
Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby.
Not guilty.
Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema.
Guilty.
Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith.
Guilty.
Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow.
Guilty.
Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey.
Guilty.
Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville.
Not guilty.
Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen.
Guilty.
Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner.
Guilty.
Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock.
Guilty.
Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren.
Guilty.
Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young.
Not guilty.
Mr. Young, not guilty.
So there you have it. 57 votes for guilty, 43 for not guilty. The president is acquitted. It takes 67 votes. It takes 2/3 of the Senate for a conviction. So former President Donald John Trump is acquitted in this second impeachment trial, as he was acquitted 1 year ago. One significant difference from last year. Last year, Mitt Romney became the first sitting senator from the president's own party to vote for an impeachment, for a conviction in an impeachment trial. Today, seven Republican senators have voted for conviction in this trial. I want to start with Rachel Scott right now. Rachel, that is two more than voted against the motion to dismiss the charges at the beginning of this trial. The surprises there, Richard Burr and Bill Cassidy.
Both of them surprises in this. And also, two of these, I'm noting, Republican senators are not running for re-election. Richard Burr as well as Pat Toomey joining this list of 7 Republican senators who have now voted to convict former President Donald Trump. It is clear that this was a very personal process.
The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. 2/3 of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the Article of Impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charge in said article.
There you have it, read by the President pro tempore of the Senate, Patrick Leahy. President Trump has been acquitted.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant at arms will escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.